So, what is the exact chronological sequence of the end times according to biblical literature? People talk about this all the time, but if you actually dig into the source texts, they detail a highly specific 20-step theological timeline. It's like a giant puzzle. Today, we're going to map out exactly what that literature says, step by step, straight from the source.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to objectively unpack this incredible sequence of events. By relying purely on original texts like Revelation, Daniel, and Matthew, we'll walk through this timeline together. That way, you can see exactly how the literature constructs the end of the age without any of the extra noise. Okay, let's dive into this. To manage the sheer volume of the 20 distinct events we're covering, we've broken our roadmap into 6 clear parts. First, the present age and the rapture. Second, the 7-year tribulation. Third, Armageddon and the second coming. Then, the millennium and final rebellion. Fifth, the ultimate final judgment. And finally, number 6, the new heaven and new earth. Now, to anchor us before we really zoom into the details, the text essentially groups history into 4 macro-level eras. We've got our current era, known as the Church Age, then a distinct 7-year block called the Tribulation. After that, a 1,000-year period known as the Millennium, and lastly, an eternal state that lasts, well, forever. Keep this big picture in the back of your mind because we are about to explore the micro-events within each of these 4 eras.
All right, Section 1, Present Age and the Rapture. The timeline begins exactly where we are right now, in our recognizable present, before initiating a massive escalation.
While our current era is described in the text as the Church Age, an age of grace where the gospel is preached to all nations, the literature outlines a very abrupt transition called the Rapture. It's absolutely crucial to note something carefully here. The text states that Jesus comes for his church during this event, but he is not yet establishing his earthly kingdom. It's a completely different mechanism.
The mechanics of this event are highly specific. According to passages in 1 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians, and John, believers are literally caught up to meet him in the air. Emphasizing that specific location, meeting in the air, is super important for understanding the timeline, because the text heavily distinguishes this event in the clouds from a much later visible return of Christ all the way down to the earth.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the narrative completely splits into 2 parallel worlds immediately following that rapture event. Up in heaven, believers experience the judgment seat of Christ, which, by the way, the text stresses is strictly for rewards, not salvation, and that's followed by the marriage supper of the Lamb. But meanwhile, at the exact same time down on earth, the narrative plunges straight into the 7-year tribulation. And that pulls us right into Section 2, the 7-year tribulation. The pacing of the literature shifts drastically here. The tension just skyrockets as the focus zeroes in entirely on the escalating catastrophes on Earth. So the text divides this 7-year period perfectly in half. The first 3.5 years kick off when a figure known as the Antichrist confirms a covenant with Israel. This begins what Daniel calls the 70th week. Following this, a brief false peace is totally shattered. Then come the 7 seal judgments. We're talking massive wars, devastating famine, widespread pestilence, martyrdom, and severe earthquakes. The sheer volume of catastrophe listed here is just staggering. Then, we hit a critical turning point, exactly at the midpoint of those 7 years. The text describes an event called the Abomination of Desolation. This is where the Antichrist breaks that covenant, enters the temple, and literally declares himself to be God. As outlined in Daniel 9 and Matthew 24, this single brazen action sets off what the literature calls the absolute worst period in human history. This immediately ushers in the Great Tribulation, the final 3.5 years, and the escalation is incredibly rapid. The false prophet emerges, the infamous Mark of the Beast 666 is mandated globally, severe worldwide persecution begins. On top of that, we see terrifying cosmic disturbances, massive plagues, rapid-fire sequences of both trumpet and bowl judgments just ravaging the earth. It is relentless. Which brings us to Section 3, Armageddon and the Second Coming. This is the chaotic global climax of the timeline, where the nations gather against Israel. So the crucial point is exactly how the source text differentiates this specific moment from the earlier rapture event. The text explicitly states, unlike the rapture, he comes visibly to earth. Every eye sees him. Summarizing Revelation 19, Matthew 24, Zechariah 14, and Acts 1, the narrative goes out of its way to establish this as a very public, highly visible, earthly arrival. There is no secret meeting in the clouds here.
we can clearly map out this rapid-fire sequence of divine victories. First, the nations gather at the Battle of Armageddon. This is immediately followed by the second coming of Jesus Christ returning with his saints. Finally, this era's antagonists face immediate, decisive judgment. According to Revelation 19, both the Antichrist and the false prophet are cast alive directly into the lake of fire. Moving right along to Section 4, the Millennium and Final Rebellion. Here, the timeline undergoes a massive tonal shift. We transition from global, catastrophic war into a period of profound structural peace. But before that era of peace can actually begin, the text outlines two specific transitional steps. First, an angel binds Satan and imprisons him for exactly 1,000 years. Second, Christ conducts a judgment of the surviving Gentile nations on earth. This is frequently referred to in Matthew 25 as the sheep and the goats judgment. Only after these two steps are fully completed does the new era commence. The characteristics of this millennium era present a staggering contrast to the tribulation. It's a total 180. Jesus is described as reigning physically from Jerusalem. The world experiences unparalleled peace and justice, remarkably long human lifespans, and a completely different spiritual climate because, well, Satan is imprisoned. All the nations are described as worshiping Christ. But surprisingly, this peace doesn't last forever. At the end of the 1,000 years, Satan is briefly released and deceives many all over again. He orchestrates a final rebellion where nations identified as Gog and Magog surround God's people. But the resolution this time is instantaneous. Fire comes down from heaven, and Satan faces his ultimate judgment, being cast permanently into the lake of fire. Now we enter Section 5, the ultimate final judgment. This marks the absolute definitive end of the Old World Order.
This is presented as a grave and highly formal event known as the Great White Throne Judgment. The text from Revelation 20 is very careful to distinguish this from earlier judgments we talked about. This one is strictly the final judgment for all the unbelieving dead, not for believers. Books are opened, including the Book of Life, to determine their fate. And in a definitive cosmic conclusion, even the very concepts of death and hell themselves are cast into the lake of fire. Let's move to Section 6 and see how this all builds into the ultimate, serene resolution of the timeline.
And this brilliantly illustrates a complete textural overhaul of the universe. The old creation, the one containing death, sorrow, and pain, completely passes away. In its place is a new creation where God makes all things new. The literature is extremely explicit about the new parameters of this reality: 0 death, 0 sorrow, and 0 pain. All of this points to one final defining anchor for the entire 20-step sequence. Summarizing Revelation 21 and 22, along with 2 Peter and Isaiah, the text concludes with this simple but incredibly profound statement: God dwells with his people forever. Wow, we have just mapped out an incredibly dense literary sequence together, having traced all 20 sequential steps directly from the source texts, moving all the way from the present church age, through intense tribulations and a millennium of peace, to a brand new earth entirely free of death or sorrow. What is your biggest takeaway from the sheer scale and structure of this complex biblical timeline? Think about how these ancient texts organized history, and I'll leave you with that to reflect on.